Your body is aging faster than it should be right now. Not from the passage of time, not from genetic programming, but from the chronic activation of stress response systems that were designed for brief emergencies and are instead running continuously every day. Stress is not just an unpleasant emotional experience that makes you feel anxious or overwhelmed. It is a physiological cascade that damages your cells, impairs your organs, and accelerates biological aging through mechanisms that are well understood and thoroughly documented. Chronic stress shortens telomeres, increases oxidative damage, promotes systemic inflammation, raises blood pressure, impairs immune function, and disrupts metabolic regulation. These effects accumulate silently over years, manifesting as cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, cognitive decline, and premature death. The relationship between chronic stress and shortened lifespan is not speculative. It has been demonstrated in hundreds of studies across millions of participants, showing that individuals with high chronic stress have mortality rates 40 to 60% higher than those with low stress, even after controlling for other risk factors, including smoking, diet, and exercise. What makes stress particularly dangerous is that it operates below conscious awareness. You may feel fine, you may function normally at work and home, but your cortisol levels remain elevated, your inflammatory markers stay high, and your cardiovascular system remains under constant strain. By the time symptoms become obvious, significant damage has already occurred. But stress is not an inevitable part of modern life. The physiological damage it causes can be prevented and in many cases reversed through specific interventions that address the biological mechanisms driving stress-related aging. Hi, I am Dr. Alex. I am an emergency medicine doctor, and after nearly 10 years in the emergency department, I have seen the catastrophic health consequences of chronic stress manifest as heart attacks in 50-year-olds, strokes in seemingly healthy individuals, and rapid functional decline in patients whose bodies have been destroyed by years of unmanaged stress. The pattern is consistent and predictable. Chronic stress does not just make you feel bad. It systematically dismantles your health through biological pathways that culminate in disease and early death. My goal now is to help people understand the physiological reality of stress-induced aging and to provide evidence-based interventions that actually work to protect against it. I want to take just a few seconds here to make you a promise. I promise to keep creating the most helpful videos I possibly can, grounded in the latest research and science to help you live longer and healthier lives. All I ask in return is that you give this fairly new channel a chance and hit the subscribe button. If you get to the end of this video and you did not think it was worth your time or you have not learned something new, then feel free to unsubscribe. No hard feelings, but if you give me your time and your attention, I will give you everything I have learned from over a decade in medicine. So please help me out. Hit the subscribe button to help this channel reach more people like you. And let us continue with the video. Before we talk about how stress damages health and shortens lifespan, we need to understand what stress actually is from a biological perspective. Stress is the activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and the sympathetic nervous system in response to perceived threat or demand. When your brain detects a stressor, whether physical danger, social conflict, work pressure, or financial worry, it triggers a coordinated response designed to mobilize resources for immediate action. Your adrenal glands release cortisol and adrenaline. Your heart rate increases, your blood pressure rises, your pupils dilate, your muscles tense, and your liver releases glucose to fuel rapid movement. Blood flow is diverted away from digestion and immune function toward muscles and the brain. This is the fight or flight response, and it is extraordinarily effective for dealing with acute threats that require immediate physical action followed by recovery. The problem is that modern stressors are rarely physical threats that can be resolved through fighting or fleeing. They are psychological, social, and economic pressures that persist for months or years without resolution. Your brain cannot distinguish between the stress of being chased by a predator and the stress of chronic work deadlines, financial insecurity, or relationship conflict. Both activate the same physiological response. But while acute stress followed by recovery is adaptive, chronic stress without recovery is pathological. When cortisol remains elevated continuously, when your sympathetic nervous system never fully disengages, the biological systems designed to protect you during emergencies become the mechanisms that destroy your health over time. Research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences used brain imaging to measure metabolic activity in the amygdala, the brain region that processes threat and activates stress responses. Participants with higher amygdala activity showed increased bone marrow activity, elevated inflammatory markers in the bloodstream, and significantly higher rates of cardiovascular events, including heart attacks and strokes, over the following 3 to 5 years. The pathway was clear. Chronic stress activation in the brain triggers immune system changes that promote inflammation throughout the body, and that inflammation drives atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease. This was not correlation without mechanism. The researchers demonstrated the complete causal chain from stress perception to immune activation to arterial damage to clinical events. The first mechanism by which chronic stress shortens lifespan is through sustained elevation of cortisol. Cortisol is essential for survival in the short term. It mobilizes energy, enhances alertness, and modulates immune function to prioritize immediate survival over long-term maintenance. But chronic elevation of cortisol causes cumulative damage to multiple organ systems. In the brain, high cortisol damages the hippocampus, which is the region responsible for memory formation and emotional regulation. Studies using MRI imaging have found that individuals with chronic stress and elevated cortisol have smaller hippocampal volumes compared to low-stress individuals. And this atrophy correlates with memory impairment and increased risk of depression. Cortisol also impairs neurogenesis, the formation of new neurons, which is essential for cognitive function and mood regulation. In the cardiovascular system, cortisol raises blood pressure by increasing sodium retention and promoting vasoconstriction. Chronic elevation of blood pressure damages arterial walls, promoting atherosclerosis and increasing risk of heart attack and stroke. Researchers found that individuals with high perceived stress have systolic blood pressure 8 to 12 millimeters of mercury higher than low-stress individuals, an increase that substantially raises cardiovascular risk. Cortisol also promotes visceral fat accumulation, the deep abdominal fat that surrounds organs and drives metabolic dysfunction. Visceral fat is metabolically active tissue that secretes inflammatory cytokines, worsens insulin resistance, and increases risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Studies have demonstrated that stress-induced cortisol elevation is a primary driver of visceral obesity independent of total calorie intake. In the immune system, chronic cortisol has complex effects. Initially, cortisol suppresses inflammation, which is why synthetic cortisol is used as an anti-inflammatory medication. But chronic elevation paradoxically increases inflammation through a process called glucocorticoid resistance. Over time, immune cells become less responsive to cortisol's anti-inflammatory signals, requiring ever higher levels to achieve the same effect. This creates a state where cortisol is chronically elevated but fails to control inflammation, resulting in systemic low-grade inflammation that accelerates aging and disease. Research measuring inflammatory markers including C-reactive protein and interleukin-6 has consistently found elevated levels in chronically stressed individuals, and these markers predict cardiovascular events, cognitive decline, and mortality. The second mechanism by which chronic stress shortens lifespan is through accelerated cellular aging. Telomeres are protective DNA sequences at the ends of chromosomes that shorten with each cell division. When telomeres become critically short, cells can no longer divide and either die or become senescent, secreting inflammatory compounds that damage surrounding tissue. Telomere length is a marker of biological age, with shorter telomeres indicating more advanced cellular aging. Research led by Dr. Elizabeth Blackburn, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering telomerase, has demonstrated that chronic psychological stress accelerates telomere shortening. Studies comparing caregivers of chronically ill children to control participants found that caregivers had significantly shorter telomeres, with the degree of shortening correlated to the number of years spent caregiving and the perceived stress level. The difference in telomere length corresponded to approximately 10 years of accelerated biological aging. Subsequent studies have confirmed this relationship across diverse populations. Individuals reporting high chronic stress have telomeres that are shorter by amounts equivalent to 5 to 15 years of chronological aging compared to low-stress individuals of the same age. The mechanism involves cortisol and oxidative stress. Chronic cortisol elevation increases production of reactive oxygen species, which are free radicals that damage DNA, including telomeres. Cortisol also reduces the activity of telomerase, the enzyme that maintains and repairs telomeres. The combined effect is accelerated telomere attrition that shortens cellular lifespan and promotes age-related disease. The third mechanism by which chronic stress shortens lifespan is through metabolic dysregulation. Stress hormones, including cortisol and adrenaline, mobilize glucose and fatty acids to provide immediate fuel for physical activity. But when this mobilization occurs chronically without corresponding energy expenditure through exercise, the result is chronically elevated blood sugar and circulating fats that promote insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome. Cortisol directly antagonizes insulin signaling, making cells less responsive to insulin signal to take up glucose. Over time, this requires the pancreas to produce ever more insulin to maintain normal blood sugar, leading to hyperinsulinemia and eventually beta cell exhaustion and type 2 diabetes. Research published in Diabetes Care followed over 7,000 adults for more than a decade and found that those reporting high chronic stress had double the risk of developing type 2 diabetes compared to low-stress individuals, even after controlling for body weight, physical activity, and diet. The mechanism was insulin resistance mediated through chronic cortisol elevation. Stress also disrupts sleep, and poor sleep further worsens insulin sensitivity, creating a vicious cycle where stress impairs sleep. Sleep deprivation increases stress hormones, and both contribute to metabolic dysfunction. The result is progressive development of metabolic syndrome characterized by abdominal obesity, high blood pressure, elevated blood sugar, and abnormal cholesterol, all of which substantially increase cardiovascular disease and mortality risk. The fourth mechanism by which chronic stress shortens lifespan is through autonomic nervous system imbalance. The autonomic nervous system has two branches. The sympathetic nervous system activates the stress response, while the parasympathetic nervous system promotes rest, recovery, and cellular repair. In a healthy state, these systems balance each other, with sympathetic activation during activity and challenge balanced by parasympathetic activation during rest and sleep. Chronic stress creates persistent sympathetic dominance where the system never fully disengages. This can be measured through heart rate variability, which is the variation in time intervals between heartbeats. High heart rate variability indicates healthy autonomic balance with strong parasympathetic tone. Low heart rate variability indicates sympathetic dominance and is a powerful predictor of cardiovascular events and mortality. Studies have found that chronically stressed individuals have significantly reduced heart rate variability compared to low-stress individuals, and this reduction predicts heart attacks, sudden cardiac death, and all-cause mortality independent of other risk factors. The mechanism involves sustained elevation of heart rate and blood pressure, impaired recovery from exertion, and reduced capacity for the restorative processes that occur during parasympathetic activation, including digestion, immune function, and cellular repair. When your body never fully enters rest and recovery mode, the cumulative deficit manifests as accelerated aging and organ system failure. Now, when we understand the four mechanisms through which chronic stress damages health and shortens lifespan, cortisol elevation and its effects on brain, cardiovascular system, and metabolism, accelerated telomere shortening and cellular aging, metabolic dysregulation, including insulin resistance and diabetes risk, and autonomic imbalance with reduced heart rate variability and impaired recovery, we automatically understand what interventions are required to protect against these effects. The solution is not eliminating all stress, which is impossible and undesirable. Acute stress in manageable doses, followed by recovery, builds resilience. The solution is preventing chronic stress activation by managing stressors where possible and deploying specific techniques that deactivate stress responses and restore physiological balance. The first intervention is regular meditation or mindfulness practice. Meditation has been studied extensively in controlled trials and consistently demonstrates measurable effects on stress physiology. Research using brain imaging has shown that regular meditation reduces metabolic activity in the amygdala, the brain region that activates stress responses, while increasing activity in the prefrontal cortex, which regulates emotional responses. Studies measuring cortisol levels have found that individuals practicing meditation for 20 to 30 minutes daily show significant reductions in morning cortisol and flatter cortisol curves throughout the day compared to control groups. Research on telomere length has found that meditation practitioners have longer telomeres compared to non-practitioners, and intensive meditation retreats increase telomerase activity, the enzyme that repairs and maintains telomeres. A landmark study published in Psychoneuroendocrinology randomly assigned stressed caregivers to either an 8-week meditation program or a control condition. The meditation group showed significant reductions in perceived stress, decreases in inflammatory markers, including interleukin-6, and increases in telomerase activity compared to controls. The effects persisted at 6-month follow-up, demonstrating that meditation produces sustained changes in stress physiology rather than transient relaxation. The mechanism involves activation of the parasympathetic nervous system and increased vagal tone, which counters sympathetic activation and promotes physiological recovery. The second intervention is regular physical activity, particularly aerobic exercise. Exercise is a hormetic stress, meaning it is a beneficial stressor that builds resilience when applied appropriately. During exercise, cortisol and adrenaline increase temporarily to mobilize energy. But regular exercise improves the efficiency of stress hormone clearance and enhances the body's ability to return to baseline after stress activation. Studies have found that physically active individuals have lower resting cortisol levels and more adaptive cortisol responses to stress compared to sedentary individuals. Exercise also increases production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a protein that supports neuron growth and protects against stress-induced hippocampal damage. Research on heart rate variability has consistently shown that regular aerobic exercise increases vagal tone and improves autonomic balance, reducing sympathetic dominance and enhancing recovery capacity. Studies tracking mortality outcomes have found that regular moderate exercise reduces all-cause mortality by 30 to 40%, with much of this benefit mediated through improved stress resilience and cardiovascular health. The optimal dose appears to be 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity per week, which can be accumulated through daily walks, cycling, swimming, or other sustained movement. The third intervention is ensuring adequate sleep duration and quality. Sleep is when the parasympathetic nervous system dominates, cortisol drops to its lowest levels, and cellular repair processes, including DNA repair and protein synthesis, occur. Chronic sleep deprivation, defined as consistently sleeping less than 7 hours per night, prevents these restorative processes and keeps the stress response activated. Studies have found that sleep-deprived individuals have elevated cortisol, increased inflammatory markers, impaired glucose metabolism, and reduced telomerase activity. Research tracking mortality outcomes has demonstrated that short sleep duration increases all-cause mortality risk by 12 to 20%, with cardiovascular disease and metabolic dysfunction as primary pathways. Improving sleep requires treating it as a non-negotiable health behavior rather than something to sacrifice when busy. This means maintaining consistent sleep and wake times, creating a dark, cool sleeping environment, avoiding screens and bright light for at least 1 hour before bed, and addressing sleep disorders, including sleep apnea, that prevent restorative sleep. For individuals whose stress interferes with sleep through racing thoughts or hyperarousal, incorporating relaxation techniques, including progressive muscle relaxation or guided imagery before bed, can facilitate the transition to sleep. The fourth intervention is building and maintaining strong social connections. Social support buffers against stress by providing emotional validation, practical assistance, and perspective on stressful situations. Research has consistently shown that socially connected individuals have lower cortisol levels, reduced inflammatory markers, and better cardiovascular health compared to socially isolated individuals facing similar stressors. The mechanism involves both psychological and biological pathways. Psychologically, social support reduces perceived threat and enhances coping. Biologically, positive social interaction activates oxytocin release, which counters cortisol and promotes parasympathetic activation. Studies measuring health outcomes have found that strong social relationships reduce mortality risk by 25 to 50%, with effects comparable to quitting smoking or treating high blood pressure. This protective effect operates partly through stress buffering. When faced with chronic stressors including work pressure, financial strain, or health challenges, individuals with strong social support show less cortisol elevation, better immune function, and lower rates of stress-related disease compared to isolated individuals facing identical stressors. Deliberately cultivating and maintaining relationships through regular contact, mutual support, and shared activities is not optional for health. It is a fundamental protective factor against stress-induced aging. Let me bring this back to the emergency department, because I want you to see the real-world consequences of unmanaged chronic stress. I treated a 52-year-old executive who came in with a massive heart attack. He had no traditional risk factors, his cholesterol was normal, his blood pressure was controlled with medication, he did not smoke, and he was not significantly overweight. But his work involved constant high-pressure deadlines, frequent travel, chronic sleep deprivation, and no time for exercise or stress management. His cortisol was chronically elevated, his inflammatory markers were extremely high, and his heart rate variability was severely reduced, all of which I discovered after his cardiac event. The heart attack was not bad luck or genetics. It was the predictable outcome of years of chronic stress destroying his cardiovascular system through the mechanisms we have discussed. Another patient was a 58-year-old woman who came in with a stroke. Her history revealed chronic caregiving stress, caring for her elderly mother with dementia while working full-time and managing her own household. She slept 4 to 5 hours per night, had no time for self-care, and reported feeling overwhelmed constantly. Her telomeres were severely shortened, indicating advanced biological aging. Her metabolic markers showed insulin resistance and prediabetes. Her immune function was impaired, making her vulnerable to infections. The stroke was the acute event that brought her to medical attention. But the underlying damage from years of chronic stress had been accumulating silently, setting the stage for catastrophic failure. The bigger picture here is that chronic stress is not just an unpleasant experience to endure. It is a biological emergency that requires intervention with the same urgency you would apply to high blood pressure or elevated cholesterol. The mechanisms linking stress to shortened lifespan are well established. Cortisol elevation damages the brain, cardiovascular system, and metabolism. Accelerated telomere shortening advances cellular aging. Metabolic dysregulation promotes diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Autonomic imbalance impairs recovery and repair. These effects compound over years, manifesting as disease and early death. But they are preventable through specific interventions, including meditation to reduce amygdala activation and cortisol levels, regular exercise to improve stress resilience and autonomic balance, adequate sleep to allow parasympathetic recovery and cellular repair, and strong social connections to buffer stress and reduce perceived threat. These are not optional wellness practices. They are essential protective interventions against stress-induced aging. So here is the bottom line, and this is what I really want you to take away from this. Chronic stress is quietly shortening your life through 4 biological mechanisms, including sustained cortisol elevation that damages your brain, cardiovascular system, and metabolism, accelerated telomere shortening that advances cellular aging by 5 to 15 years, metabolic dysregulation that promotes insulin resistance and diabetes, an autonomic imbalance that impairs recovery and increases cardiovascular risk. The mortality risk associated with chronic stress is substantial, with stressed individuals showing 40 to 60% higher death rates compared to low-stress individuals. This is not speculation. This is documented in large prospective studies tracking hundreds of thousands of people over decades. The interventions that protect against stress-induced aging are accessible and evidence-based. Daily meditation reduces amygdala activity and cortisol while increasing telomerase. Regular exercise improves stress resilience and autonomic balance. Adequate sleep allows parasympathetic recovery and cellular repair. Strong social connections buffer stress and reduce inflammation. These interventions work because they address the biological mechanisms driving stress-related damage. The time to implement them is now, before years of chronic stress cause irreversible harm. And finally, just to end, please subscribe to the channel if you found this useful to help me reach more people like you.